What's going on, everyone? Today I'm going to be showing you how to export a Rhino 3D model into Unreal Engine 4. This is going to be helpful for those of you who are ArchViz artists or just general 3D artists that build their 3D models within Rhino and texture UV map and generate lighting within Rhino. The workflow going from Rhino to Unreal isn't as straightforward as you'd think it might be. Many other applications like SketchUp, 3ds Max, and Revit have their dedicated Datasmith plugin that allows you to export from those particular applications into a Datasmith file format that then is imported into Unreal Engine. We're going to do a little bit different for Rhino, but it'll still allow you to get your model in cleanly with all of its UV mapping and textures preserved. So let's get started. The first thing that I want to mention to you guys is the naming convention of your layers and blocks within Rhino. So typically when you create a new layer or a new block and you're typing in the name of that layer or block, you're going to want to put a space in between the two words. Unreal Engine doesn't really like spaces between words. So for example, if I wanted to create a layer for my table, I would type in table underscore geometry. And so this way, when you import it into Unreal Engine, it'll recognize the layer properly with the underscore. Same goes for blocks. Blocks are a big thing that you want to consider implementing into your project before you import this into Unreal Engine. It'll allow you to group that specific block within Unreal Engine, and instead of having, say, 4 legs, I can have my one block geometry that imports as a single actor within my Unreal Engine scene or static mesh within that scene, instead of duplicating 4 individual legs. So you can see here I've created a leg block, and each of my 4 legs are those blocks, as well as these borders around the tables. So I want to create blocks in as many spaces and for as many geometry in the model as I can. That way they're grouped properly and grouped cleanly within Unreal Engine. So the next thing I want to go over quickly, and this isn't really the tutorial to be doing this in, but how to apply textures within Rhino and how that will translate into Unreal Engine. So of course, if you're using V-Ray or any other third-party rendering applications, you can apply your materials and your lighting, which I'll show later, directly within V-Ray, and this method will be the same for you. But within Rhino, if you want to apply a material to your geometry, you're just going to click on this little materials tab, and you can create a new material by clicking the plus button. I typically start by pressing custom. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to leave mine custom for now because I already have my material in here. And then in order to apply an image to that texture, you're going to want to click under textures and under color. You can click on the little check mark. It'll open up your directory and you need to browse to where your material is. I'll select my wood. It'll import it, and you can see here it changed the color of the little widget or thumbnail of our texture. And then I'm going to import both our color or what's called the diffuse map and my bump map, which will be converted automatically into a normals map within Unreal Engine. So when I click the plus next to bump, select my bump map, which is also considered a normal map, hit OK. And you can't see anything changed in that little thumbnail, but it basically just adds a little bumpiness or little texture grain, I guess you could say, over the top of your otherwise flat static diffuse texture. Okay, so once we have all of our materials applied, you'll notice that some of the materials are not rotated properly. And again, this isn't necessarily the tutorial to go through this, but I'm going to show you quickly how to UV map those textures in a way that'll allow you to have some control over the orientation of the grain of the wood in this instance, or something else. So I'm going to give you an example here of how to apply one of those UV maps to a specific portion of geometry within my model. So I'm going to double click on this block, and you can see that my texture is not oriented the way that I want it. I want the grain running horizontally so that it sort of runs with the length of the side of this table. So I double clicked into my block. You want to make sure that you already have your texture applied. If you don't, you will not be able to see the UV mapping dialog. So single click on your geometry. Now, if you're not in this tab already, click on the Properties tab, and then you're going to see this little checker box cylinder thing called Texture Mapping. Click on that, and you're going to have a bunch of different options here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to manually unwrap this texture. So I'm going to click on Unwrap, and I can select the rails that I can imagine being sort of the cutting lines when unwrapping my mesh. So I can probably go through this in another video. There is a huge learning curve when UV mapping. The general idea is whatever rail you click on is going to be cut so that when it unwraps your mesh or your geometry, it will create a map of that unwrapped texture that then you can scale up and down. So once I've selected the rails that I want to cut, I'm going to hit enter. And up here it says the UV texture coordinates were successfully unwrapped for selected objects. Once I've done that, I'm going to click on this red checkered box over here. It's going to allow you to draw a rectangle within your viewport. Typically, I'll go into my top-down viewport so that I can see it not on a perspective. And you can see when I drew that rectangle, it changed the way the material looked. So now, like I was mentioning before, my material is unwrapped and cut along those rails that I selected. And you can see here I didn't do it perfectly because I have two separate objects. In the ideal world, they'd be all be connected. But for this tutorial, this is okay. So you can see how the texture's still running the wrong way. I want to rotate that. If you don't have these red, green, and blue elements within your model, you're going to want to go to the bottom of the screen and click Gumball. It'll toggle it on and off. Gumball is super helpful when you're trying to move things around and rotate things quickly. So I can click on the red arrow and drag, and it'll move around. And when I let go, you can see that the texture changed. Same with the green. I can move that up, and it moves the UV map up on the texture. What I'm going to do here is single click on this blue quarter circle, and I'm going to type in 90. This is going to rotate my UV mapping for my geometry by 90 degrees. And when I do that, you can see here that it rotated the texture so that it's running along the grain. Now that I have this the way that I want it, I'm going to go over the right hand side here, and I'm going to click apply. That sort of bakes the UV map onto your mesh so that it is now in the proper orientation and at the proper scale that you want it. One thing I do want to mention too with UV mapping is if I click on my geometry and I open back up that UV map, if the scale of this UV map is not the size that you want it, you can type in scale over on the left hand side after you've selected your UV map, and you can change your scale. So I just single clicked and say I wanted my texture to be twice as small. I'm going to scale this up by 2. And the reason why you scale up in order for your texture to be smaller is because you're scaling up your UV map of your geometry, of the texture on your geometry in relationship to the texture. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but you'll see when I scale it up by 2 what happens. So if I type in 2 and hit enter, you can see there that the texture got twice as small, and I'll do it again here. So I'll undo. You can see the texture moved and got bigger. And when I type in scale and hit, say, 5, the texture is much more refined and smaller. So I'm going to hit apply again, and you're going to hit OK on your block editor if you're editing within a block. And now you can see here that both sides of this apron are scaled nicely. Now I'm going to run through quickly, speed the video up, apply the mapping to all the other surfaces, and then we'll get started with the next portion of this tutorial. Okay, so now that we have all of our UV coordinates mapped properly on our geometry, I'm going to open V-Ray and just render this out quickly to see if it renders properly. So I'm just going to click render, and you can see here all of my textures are mapped properly. And if you can't see your texture when you're editing your UV map, I should add that you're going to want to change your viewport I guess render type to rendered. Typically I think it's unshaded. Then you're going to be able to see your actual texture on your surface. Okay, now that we have everything UV mapped properly, what we're going to want to do is convert our NURBS block geometry into a mesh. This is going to be important because when you import your mesh into Unreal Engine, it will preserve all of the UV maps. If you were to import a NURBS geometry into Unreal Engine, the UV mapping is not preserved at all. So in order to convert this to a mesh, you're just going to select everything. You're going to type in mesh. You can change the polygon count if you'd like. I'm going to set mine to the max. Hit OK. Give it a couple of seconds to generate your mesh. If you have a huge scene, you don't want to convert everything to a mesh at once. It'll probably crash Rhino. I would go chunk by chunk or scene by scene and converting things into meshes. And then once you have everything converted, you're going to click off. It'll look like nothing happened, but you're going to click off to deselect everything. And you're going to type in SEL mesh, which stands for select mesh. And we're going to create a new layer. In this case, I named mine table mesh. We're going to right click on that layer, change objects to that layer. So you're going to change all your meshes over to the table mesh layer. Then I'm going to turn off the default layer that has all of my NURBS geometry on it. So now you can see here, I have my table with all of the proper UV maps applied to my textures, and my model has been converted from NURBS geometry to a mesh geometry. Now that we've done all this, the model is good and ready to export, but I want to show you one other thing. I want to show you how to add in lighting into your Rhino scene that is then able to be exported into Unreal Engine. So in order to do that, I'm going to open up my lighting prompt by typing in lights. And you can see here my scene only has a sun and a skylight applied. I want to put a nice spotlight on my table. So I'm going to hit the plus button and click on spotlight. And now I'm going to create the spotlight. I want it to shine on one of the corners to get a nice diffuse light across the top of the table. So I'm going to click on a corner, generate the overall radius and diameter of the spotlight. And then I'm going to go into one of my side views and angle it in a way that looks nice. So what I'm going to do is angle it straight up, and then I'm going to rotate it. And you can see here in my rendered viewport, the light is being cast onto my geometry. and you can't see the light in the rendered viewport, which is kind of annoying. So you have to go back to shaded to get it perfect. And I'm just going to mess around with this quickly and get it generally how I want it within the scene. Once you're in Unreal Engine, you can also change this. So, okay, that looks good. I'm going to go back to the rendered view, and you can see the light is being shined on the top of the table. Now that we have our lighting and our meshes ready to be exported into Unreal Engine, we need to make sure that the scale of this project is in the proper format. Unreal Engine operates in the centimeters building unit scale, so I want to type in units. In this case right now I'm in inches. I want to change that to centimeters, hit OK, and hit yes so that the model is scaled down in centimeters. So now that we're up to this point, we are ready to export this into Unreal Engine. So all we're going to do is save this as our typical .3dm file. So I'm going to click Save As. I'm going to save it as a table, as a 3dm file, hit Save, and there we go. So now when I open up Unreal Engine, I'm going to create a new project. In my case, I'm going to select the architecture template, hit Next, use a blank template so there's nothing else within the file. I'm going to turn on ray tracing just for this example. I would advise not to do that if you don't have an RTX graphics card. And then I'm going to select my project location. In this case, it's on my desktop. And then I'm going to name this test table 1. Make sure you don't have any spaces in between this file name. You can just connect all of the words together or use underscores to connect the words together. Hit create project. Unreal Engine's going to load. So within Unreal Engine, I'm just in the basic architecture blank template. That's what I prefer to work in when I'm first starting. So within this template, up here, you may or may not see this Datasmith icon. If you don't see it, you're going to hit settings. You want to go to plugins, and you can type in the search bar in the upper right, Datasmith. And you want to make sure you have the Datasmith importer enabled. You want the Datasmith content enabled. And then you want to make sure you have the Datasmith CAD importer enabled. The CAD importer is what allows you to import that 3DM Rhino model into Unreal Engine. Now that you've checked all those, you're going to close it. You should get a little icon in the lower right-hand corner asking if you want to restart Unreal Engine. You do need to do that to apply the changes. So once you've restarted Unreal Engine, you should see this Datasmith icon up at the top of your screen. So we're going to click on that, select, in my case, the table Rhino model, hit open, and then I'm going to create a new folder within the Unreal Engine project. You do this by right-clicking on the gray space, hit new folder, and I'm going to type in Datasmith table 2. Make sure there's no spaces in between any of the words or letters or numbers, and hit OK. So after we hit OK, you're going to get a bunch of different import options here from Datasmith. You're going to get the ability to import geometry, materials and textures, lights, cameras, animations. In my experience, cameras and animations has not worked for me. Only lighting, materials, and geometry has. So I would check all of those. And then under the geometry and tessellation options, we want to make sure that we set the geometry to import Rhino meshes and UVs. As we did in the previous step, we converted our NURBs into Rhino meshes. If you didn't do that and you just imported your NURB geometry, then you would want to import it as NURBs, and Unreal Engine will tessellate it, basically trying to create a mesh as realistic as possible to your NURBs model. The issue with that, like I mentioned before, is that all of your UV mapping gets deleted. So when we click import Rhino meshes and UVs, it brings in our meshes and the UVs that we created. Now we can hit import. So now you can see our table imported into the model properly. If you're moving around in the model and it's really fast, just go up here to the camera icon, change it down, change the camera speed down to 2 or 3, and you can get a much smoother transition here. I'm going to move this compass out of the way really quick. Okay, so you can see here our model is in here with our meshes, with our materials applied, and you can also see here that Unreal created our light. It converted it from our Rhino light. So just so you all understand how this works, you see over here after I imported my Datasmith file, a table folder, or I guess header, was added into the browser over here. That table is the layer that we imported from Rhino. And you can see here, each of the individual meshes were imported as well. So I can either click on them on the right hand side to select them, or I can click on them in the viewport to select them. Click on one of your individual meshes and right click and hit edit. You can then click on UV and select UV channel 0. UV channel 0 is where our texture mapped UV channel will go. So you can see here mine did import properly, so my texture is correct. And then if you also click on that UV tab, your UV light maps should have been automatically generated on import. So if you click on that, you can see Unreal Engine generated UV channel, UV surfaces for those light maps. So say we want this table to be one single object and not a bunch of individual objects. One way we can go about changing that is selecting all of our meshes by clicking on the topmost mesh on the right hand little box, holding down shift, and then clicking on the last. This will select all of the meshes that make up that table. You can then right click on those meshes and click convert actors to static mesh. And I'm just going to save it in my meshes folder. Hit OK. And now you can see here in the lower left hand side, it created a new static mesh actor. If I drag that into the model and I go over to it, you can see here it's one solid object and it was renamed as static mesh. Now I can right click on that, go to edit, rename, and I can rename that to static mesh table. And now instead of having individual components that make up the entire table, we have one single table. And you can see on the right hand side here, all of your materials are still maintained for each mesh element that was combined. This is good because if I want to change the legs of my table to a different color or material, I can just drag that new material into whatever element makes up the legs of that chair. Say I want to add a couple of benches into this model and I don't want to re-import the table and everything else with it. One thing that I'm going to show you how to do is not only import additional geometry into the scene, but also how to only import that geometry and not the table again. Because if you're working on a large file, you don't want to re-import the same geometry over and over. It's going to make you recalculate your lighting for the entire scene, and it's also going to have to compile shaders every time. So we really only want to import anything new that's been drawn in the Rhino model. So one thing I'm going to do here, now that I have my static mesh, my single static mesh geometries, I'm going to delete out the original mesh so that I only have the static mesh. And then I'm going to go back into Rhino and I'm just going to draw a simple rectangular bench. And this bench is going to be imported into Unreal Engine, and only the bench will be imported. So now I have my bench. I'm going to resave my Rhino model just as I did before. Save it as table, save over your existing file. Now when I go back into Unreal Engine, I'm going to navigate to my Datasmith folder for my table, And within that folder, you'll see the Datasmith file. You want to right click on that Datasmith file, press import. Now, when you import, you don't want to re-import old geometry or things that have been deleted within Unreal Engine. So this respawn deleted actors needs to be unchecked. And after you do that, you want to hit import. And now you can see here, after I hit re-import, my bench has been the only thing to be imported into the model. So that's it. That's how you get your Rhino model into Unreal Engine with all of its proper UV mapping and lighting. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, please leave a comment below. Let me know what else you guys want to see in the future. And as always, have a good one.